Well, hi everyone, and welcome back to Adam's Music Box, where today I want to talk to you about one of the great artists, frankly, of all time. And this, of course, is Peter Frampton. Now, Peter Frampton has had a paradox travel with him throughout his career, in that he's been typecast, both figuratively and, in one case, even literally. And this, of course, impacted his music career. But let's go back to the very beginning. Frampton was something of a child prodigy, and in the late 60s, he fronted a band called The Herd. In 69, he got his first really big break when he joined Steve Marriott of the Small Faces to form the great Humble Pie. And the work that Frampton and Marriott did together was really, really good. But it was only a few years later that Frampton decided to go out solo in 1971 because, well, Marriott wanted to go in more of the harder bluesy rock direction. Frampton's strength was always as a very chordal and very melodic songwriter, and that really is, in many ways, the essence of Peter Frampton. All great songwriters have one thing in common, and that's that they're able to do things with chords that the average listener and the average songwriter wouldn't expect. In all of Peter Frampton's music, there are very complex chord structures. Some of them hint at jazz, some of them have classical leanings, and they're all presented in a very straightforward rock and roll package. But the reason that the songs, in spite of the somewhat expected package, are so endearing and so interesting is because of his amazing ability to take chords and put them in a succession that is surprising, that is intriguing, that sucks the audience into the music. He is a master songwriter, and he's also an excellent guitar player, which is a point that Rick Beato has made a lot. And yet, Frampton, in the sort of wider public, isn't necessarily thought of this, even though among musicians, he absolutely is and always has been. His first solo album was ultimately released in 72, and it's one of his very best, one of the best albums of the year, called Wind of Change. And he had a cast of great musicians with him. Billy Preston was on the album, Ringo Starr made an appearance. It was really well recorded, well produced, and very highly recommended. He then went on to release another very strong album, Frampton's Camel, then Something's Happening, and then the self-titled Frampton, whose image you see behind me. And three out of those four albums were released in audiophile versions on both LP and SACD just last year, which shows that there is a revival of interest in Frampton's music. Interestingly, while he had success with Humble Pie and while his solo records were very much loved by musicians in the know, he wasn't selling quite enough records to make the executives happy. But luckily, the executives he worked with were at A&M, Herb Alpert's record label. And unlike so many record labels that were a bit more corporate, as the record industry got less and less about art and more about commerce, even though there were always those components, they kept him on the label and they waited for him to do something extraordinary. Now, let's talk about the state of live albums in the 70s. Typically, a live album was seen by the record company as a cheap way to sell a lot of records of an artist who had been doing something pretty big. So, Yes had a big hit with Close to the Edge. What does the label do? They put out a double LP Yes Songs live album. Deep Purple was doing well with Machine Head. So, what did they do? They put out Made in Japan, which at that time was actually a synonym for something of low quality. Less than 10 years later, Japanese electronics became synonymous with high quality, which shows you how the language around things changes with circumstance. In Frampton's case, things were a bit different. His solo albums were selling they modestly, respectably, but not stratospherically. And so the decision was made to put out a double live album of Peter Frampton playing his best material. And this album became, if not the best selling live album of all time, certainly one of them, certainly the highest at the time. And this was, of course, Frampton Comes Alive. Everybody had it. This might again sound hard, be hard to understand for people who've come of age in the era of musical bifurcation, where everyone is segmented into their own little genres, as though we're living in a certain section of a record store and we don't dare to venture out of it. But Frampton Comes Alive was an album that, if you were, let's say, if you were under 30 in 1976, chances are you had a copy of this album. It was huge, to coin a phrase. Now, what made it good? Well, several things. One, it functioned as a kind of greatest hits album where all of the truly great, very harmonically, chordally complex songs that Frampton had already released on his four previous albums, they were all put together in a nice package. But because a lot of people hadn't heard them before, it felt both like a debut album and like a greatest hits album combined. Number two, while live albums aren't always as recorded as well as studio albums for obvious reasons, less time, less preparation, you're not in a sonically controlled environment, it was recorded really well on the whole, especially for a live album at the time. And the other reason is that he's a really good musician. Um, there's always the stereotype of the musician who can, after 35 takes, really come off sounding good in the studio. But Frampton was a musician's musician. His voice was stellar, his guitar playing amazing, Bob Mayo on the keyboards was great. The whole band was really great. And the album became iconic. Now, Frampton continued to write and perform really, really great music after that, but fame being what it is, he was marketed as something he didn't like. He was marketed as sort of a teeny bopper sex symbol, and he wasn't that. He was just a bona fide musician. But the follow-up album, I'm in You, featured him, half shirtless, lying down. He hated that cover, even though there's some really good songs on the album. And then he was cast in a film that ruined temporarily not only his career but that of the Bee Gees, and this was the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band film. Now, one would think that a film based on a top-selling Beatles record would be an instant hit. That's certainly what the film's producers thought. But the Beatles didn't approve it. They had no input into it. And it was a very goofy, sort of post-psychedelic type of film. And people just didn't take it seriously. The plot didn't really have any rhyme or reason. It's since become a cult classic, as all of these things tend to do. But at the time, the audiences didn't like it, and the critics hated it even more. Weirdly, Aerosmith made an appearance in the film. It wasn't too bad on their career, but it was quite bad on a lot of the others who were in it. And so while Frampton kept making music, his sales were way down, which is partly because of the film, but also partly because of the fact that it's hard to commercially follow up an album as huge as Frampton Comes Alive. It was in the mid 80s, though, when he came out with a kind of Renaissance album, a rebirth. And this was very much in the 80s rock sound, but with all of the classic Frampton chordality, harmony, great guitar playing that you'd expect. And this was called Premonition. And it was about this time that he was thrown both an economic and musical bone by his friend David Bowie, who invited him to play guitar on his Glass Spider tour. Frampton then began climbing back up in terms of popularity. He started playing more festivals. He released in the 90s a part two of Frampton's Come Alive, featuring his live greatest hits of everything that he wrote after Frampton Comes Alive. And since then, he's been putting out high quality music, touring the world, and really having a stable audience, both the nostalgia circuit and young people coming to appreciate his musicianship. But when it comes to this typecasting issue, he shouldn't be remembered as this sort of teen idol, nor should he be remembered for that stupid film that he was in. He was someone who was able to take complex songs with complex harmony and great guitar playing and package them in a way that was ultra accessible. Now, this is a theme that I talk about a lot because I, for one, think that complex, highly stratified music for its own sake doesn't really work. I think that you've got to take that complexity and make it attractive to the listener, because that's talent. A computer you could go to some AI tool for music and say, write me a composition with some of the most complex chord changes, complex odd rhythms, blah, blah, blah. It could spit something out. Does it have soul? Is it listenable? Is it danceable? Is it something that you can sit there and really take in emotionally? Probably not. With Peter Frampton, he really never wrote a bad song. Everything is either good or great. And that isn't easy to do, especially across a very long career. So if you're not familiar with Peter Frampton because of your age, definitely delve into it. Delve into the Premonition album, his first four solo albums, of course, Frampton Comes Alive, and then continue to explore his whole catalog. Because even the stuff from the early 80s that some people didn't like, it's actually really, really good. I can't stress that enough. And if you've forgotten about Peter Frampton, remember that he's a lot more, and always has been a lot more, than the Frampton Comes Alive poster that you probably had on your bedroom wall in 1976 and 77. So we're saluting Peter Frampton, who's still out there doing his thing. I do believe he's been diagnosed with a kind of muscular disease, but he's doing okay. He's playing, he's looking good, he's sounding good. So check him out, because he may well be coming to a town near you. Like, subscribe, and we will see you next time.